Our final speaker before the panel discussion is Mr. Ian Law, who'll talk about the international scene. Ian has more than 30 years' experience in advanced wastewater and reuse projects in South Africa, Southeast Asia and Australia. He's a member of the Australian Water Recycling Centre of Excellence Research Advisory Committee, and he was their observer, and a very active observer is not quite the right word. I think I saw more emails from Ian than just about anyone else on the steering committee. So, Mr. Ian Law.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of participating today. I feel honoured to have actually been on that steering committee. It was a pretty high-powered group of people, but it was kept in its place by a pretty high-powered project manager. Stuart, thank you. What I was asked to do was talk a little bit about the international perspective. What is happening internationally? We often see as we go around the traps that people say, oh, this is all very well, but is it actually being used elsewhere? How do they control it? If it is being used, how do they control it? So I want to just give you a couple of examples of where it is being applied. The report does have a chapter on international use, and I would encourage you to have a look at that, because it really does. It can open one's eyes as to what others are doing and also why they are doing it. And we'll find that there are tremendous similarities with the findings in this report and the reasons why they embarked on direct potable reuse. As we all know, the first plant that was ever commissioned in the world called direct potable reuse was in Windhoek in Namibia in 1968. That was a fair while back. But let's put that aside and let's just have a look at why they did it. And a lot of this is going to sound very familiar to our situation, to situations in part of our country. Low rainfall, high evaporation, low runoff. All surface sources within 500 k's had been exploited. Further sources were very expensive, and so it goes on. I put it to you that those reasons why they embarked on that in 1968 applies to any of the other examples that I'm going to show you here, but it also gives good reason why when we sit down to evaluate options for securing our supplies into the future, there's no reason why we should not consider an option that these guys did way back in 1968. I might add that the plant, since 1968, the technologies have changed. There's no way that today they would be able to use the technologies they had in 1968. That's just why it is so important we keep abreast of technologies, and why in that report that's been put out compiled by Stuart does address technologies that are used, and Jörg has so eloquently put before us today, the technologies are here today, we can use them. A pretty poor photograph of what the plant looked like in 1968. Actually a bit of a dog's breakfast, because it had just been added to on a very piecemeal fashion, but they produced a quality that complied with the standards at that time. In 2002, the new plant was commissioned with a lot of European money, operated by a European consortium, to very strict HACCP guidelines, very strict regulatory control, and has been going since that period. As Stuart showed on his slide, it has 2 feed sources. However, we must remember that for 90% of the time, the quality coming from the dam is inferior to that coming from the wastewater treatment plant. And so it has been operating for 90% of the time on the effluent coming in from the wastewater treatment plant. That is just a function of Africa today, with people moving to live close to water supplies in a fairly uncontrolled manner. Look at the technology that they're using today. There's no reverse osmosis in there, but they are able to produce the water that they are safely using in Windhoek. And as I joked with Mark O'Donoghue on the way here today, the Windhoek Lager is some of the finest beer that I've actually tasted. So there's nothing wrong with that water. There hasn't been much action in direct potable reuse since 1968, other than, of course, the Windhoek plant in 2002. But all of a sudden, there's been a real upsurge in discussion, talk, promotion. But as Carleen mentioned earlier, to what effect has it actually, what has it achieved? All of these papers, documentations are out there. I would suggest that they've been read, hopefully, put in the bottom drawer, and that's it, because it is too difficult. I think taking what Carleen so eloquently said, we've got to take that challenge up now and be prepared to discuss it in open fora with whoever we need to talk to. I might add that there are a couple there of articles that the author of this report was responsible for. So he's had a long history in that area. Let's look at direct potable reuse in the US. Cloudcroft, New Mexico, 2007, started up. Aurora, Colorado, 2010, started up. Big Spring, Texas, starting up. Wichita Falls, Texas, online due in 2014. Brownwood in Texas again. Why Texas? Texas is in dire straits in terms of water supply. You know, they have some mega companies in Texas that need water. So they have to come up with a solution. They've gone down the direct potable reuse route. They are very interested in the fact that we have guidelines for potable reuse. They've got copies of those. They are looking at them, and their regulators are looking at manipulating in some shape or form what we have done in this country to regulate those plants in Texas. San Diego is a trial plant at the current time, a demonstration plant, ostensibly for IPR, but with the interest in California now on direct potable reuse, where the Senate has agreed to empower the California Department of Public Health to produce standards and guidelines, not only for IPR, but for direct potable reuse. Who knows? Watch this space. We may find something a little bit different than IPR in San Diego. And remember that in around about 1999, 2000, San Diego was going to go down the route of IPR, using exactly the same scheme that they are now currently demonstrating. And because of there was council elections, the toilet to tap phrase was coined, and that's what killed it. Aurora in Colorado has come up with an interesting scheme. This one's been operating quietly under the radar. It doesn't have reverse osmosis. You don't have to have the high-end technology. The importance, though, is, as Jörg quite rightly mentioned, is having multiple barriers of technologies that operate independently in an optimum fashion. Plus, as Stuart mentioned earlier, operators and managers who understand what this is all about. In South Africa, yes, there has been a fair amount happening under the radar. Beaufort West in 2011, it's situated about 5 or 6 hours northeast of Cape Town in a very arid area and running out of water. What do? They had to have a solution, and they went for the direct potable reuse route. Durban, we've had some discussion from Stuart today on the fairly innovative way that they are managing their engineered storage basins in the direct potable reuse option. For those that don't know, Durban is a coastal city, and their water supply catchments, their raw water catchments are obviously inland. The cost of transporting effluent from the coast back there was just prohibitive. So they have looked at the direct potable reuse option. Small coastal town, Hermanus, A very attractive place, excellent fishing. They've adopted their direct potable reuse design, and construction is to commence. Cape Town, the mother city in South Africa, started looking at potable reuse way back in the early 80s, tried pilot studies, satisfied themselves with the performance of technologies at that time, shelved it, developed some more supplies, however, are now at a stage where they have reached a junction point. They've got a tipping point. Where do they get their water from? They've decided to go down the potable reuse option, looking at both direct and indirect, and the tenders were submitted in July 2013, and awards have still to be made. In all of these, people often say to me as I go around, but you know, Windhoek, third world country, darkest South Africa, really there's not a lot of community outreach, it just happens. As same comments are often made about what happens in Singapore. That's not the case here. There was a lot of community outreach in Beaufort West. They really did try and be transparent in what they were trying to do. The interesting thing I find is that they actually called this Beaufort West New Water. And having worked with the Singaporeans, I'm sure they patented the term New Water. So maybe this is not a slide I show in Singapore. But it's the whole thing of transparency comes out there as well. So it's a very real exercise for them. India, direct potable reuse. For those that understand the rate of growth in India, the number of mega cities and growing number of mega cities in areas where there are not abundant water sources, they are looking at direct potable reuse. Two very good examples would be Delhi and Bengaluru, which is the new term for Bangalore. Direct potable reuse. Tenders are being called, they're all deboot projects, private sector involvement and operation, long-term operation, and the tenders are being called next. Tenders are being worked on at the present time and will be called in 2014-15. Look at the treatment train at the bottom there. And that is a river which goes into a BNR plant, an MBR, which goes back into a river, then goes from there straight into a reservoir, and from there straight into an AWTP, but with no RO, with the ozone BAC option that we have a number of examples in this country of, and which forms the cornerstone of the Windhoek plant. They're going down that route. That's the design they are thinking of going out with the tenders. We've touched on, or Stuart mentioned, the de facto or unplanned reuse, and I can remember participating in a direct potable reuse workshop at an IWA Leading Edge Technology Conference in Brisbane. I think it was 2011 year, with Jonathan Clemens from PWN in Holland, in the Netherlands, and after I sort of strutted my stuff about Windhoek and all this sort of stuff, he says, look, we've actually been doing direct potable reuse in the Netherlands for about 50 years. We live, to coin the phrase, at the arse end of the Rhine River, and the quality of the water is seriously compromised. It's far more contaminated than today's secondary effluents. So that's their water supply. That's their raw water source. They treat it with technologies that we use today in our AWTPs, be it for the Yatla Brewery, be it for the Western Corridor scheme, be it for the groundwater replenishment scheme in Orange County, be it for the new plant that's being designed or going to be designed in Perth. Same technology, because we know that it's tried and true and can work. All of those technologies are part and parcel of treatment trains that we use, and we know, we understand, we know how to operate them. Those are the main drivers for success. And the one I found very interesting, and I must acknowledge Jonathan for these slides, was the third bullet point. Earned customers and politicians' respect and trust. And when we listen to Carleen today giving us a challenge as to where to from here, perhaps that's an aim, is to have people trust us when we say, guys, this ain't so bad. Let's consider it in the raft of options that we know are safe and true for future water supplies. What I'd like to leave you with is that direct potable reuse is being implemented in many countries of the world, particularly those where freshwater supplies are limited on the one hand. On the other hand, their population is increasing. They've got to do something. Dual water supplies isn't going to help in the long term. There's got to be something more radical. So I was very pleased to see the conclusion in the ATSI report, and despite what Peter said, I bit my tongue a number of times and was a very quiet observer, to see that the conclusion, which I totally support, is that DPR should be an alternative that is in the mix of options whenever we sit down to evaluate what we're going to do in the future to secure our water supplies. The challenge we have, though, is, and building on what Carleen mentioned earlier, what do we do from here? I know there is a panel discussion, and I hope that some of the questions that would be put to the panel, and with their wise counsel, we will come up with a strategy for what we do now, other than putting this report in the bottom drawer. The centre is taking the first step. There is the International Water Association Water Reclamation Conference in Windhoek at the end of this month. The centre is running a workshop there. Stuart is presenting on this project. Some of us in this room are presenting a paper on validating the Windhoek plant against our own Australian guidelines. And if you want to know the result, you better come to the conference. But it is it's so important that we engage, we take up Carleen's challenge. The challenge is, who is that we? What do we do? Thank you very much.